Let me invite Dr. Balakrishna Pisupati, Program Manager, UNEP Law Divisions. He will present on the topic, the UN Biodiversity Conference, COP15. What is this and how will it impact Thailand? Over to you.
Thank you very much. I hope you all can hear me and see me. Greatly appreciate the invitation. Very distinguished participants, experts, friends, colleagues. The topic of the day is very, very important. As it was mentioned earlier, the 196 countries that are parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD in short, will be meeting in December to decide on a global biodiversity framework that will be supported by a number of targets, 22 targets as of now, to secure the biodiversity at global level. And the context of this meeting is very important for a country like Thailand. And personally, for me, it's a great pleasure to be joining you here, because among the countries in Asia, Thailand became a party to the convention quite late, but it became a party very well prepared. And I was quite associated with that process with UEPP at that time between 2001 and 2003. So certainly the context of the discussion today, that is looking at the role of biodiversity and business, is extremely important. The Conference of the Parties is coming at a time when we should have had a framework in 2020. Unfortunately, because of the COVID pandemic and a number of reasons, it got delayed, and countries are going to be meeting in December to finalize the framework. As countries are going to be meeting at the Conference of Parties to the Convention, there are two other meetings that are also very important. The 10th meeting of the parties to the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety, that looks at safety in biotechnological interventions and applications. And the 4th meeting of the parties to the Nagoya Protocol on access to genetic resources and equitable sharing of benefits. So essentially, it's a combination of 3 different meetings that will happen in December. And this particular meetings will be interspersed with a high-level segment, a ministerial segment, that will be held between 15th and 17th of December 2022. And for those of you who are familiar with the CBD or the convention, you are aware that parties actually have set for themselves a number of targets in the past as well. We have had a set of targets 2002 to 2010. And subsequently in Nagoya, during the 10th meeting of the Conference of Parties, countries have agreed for the Aichi biodiversity targets. And currently, we are discussing the 3rd set of targets, 2022 to 2030. So what the meeting is going to be discussing are a number of critical issues. The first issue is the seriousness with which we have started addressing the loss of biodiversity, and also fairly well understood by appropriate documentation on the contributions of biodiversity to both businesses as well as securing local lives and livelihoods. Secondly, even though a lot of us understand the links between biodiversity and climate change, or the impacts of conservation for both climate change adaptation and climate change mitigation, the Glasgow Conference of Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change for the first time provided a much larger framework of discussions on integrating or synergizing actions related to nature conservation or biodiversity conservation. So the context of that is also very important. And we expect that the forthcoming meeting in Egypt of the Climate COP would also continue to discuss it. Now that countries have assessed the implementation and realized that the measures that were undertaken by the countries for stopping the rate of loss of biodiversity was rather inadequate, certainly there is a huge push to make this current framework much more ambitious. And as many of you know, any of these global frameworks at the multilateral level, decisions on how to implement a convention is taken at the global level, but the responsibility for implementing those decisions are always at the national level. And that is why it is very important for a country like Thailand with such enormous biodiversity and also the cultural diversity associated with conservation to understand the implications of the decisions that will be made during the CBD COP. I'd like to now quickly focus on what are the key elements of the framework and the targets, and what are the expectations or what are the ongoing discussions in terms of the projected outcomes. Currently, the framework looks at two different approaches which countries need to be very seriously considering. The first one is to look at what is called a whole of government approach. No more biodiversity conservation is the responsibility of Ministry of Environment or Department of Environment, but it has to be owned, it has to be addressed, it has to be implemented by all the different bodies, all the different elements and ministries of the government. That is why this particular framework is supporting a whole of government approach. The second one is also to take what is called a whole of society approach. There is no one stakeholder group who will be impacted by biodiversity loss. What we are discussing today is in the context of business community, in the context of the global compact and its interests, but certainly the other segments of the society also will have an important role to play. So the first point is that countries need to be a little bit more serious about how to engage with other parts of the government, other ministries, other stakeholders. The second one is, unlike in the past, when the focus of the framework was more ecosystem based, this time the focus of the framework is much broad based. Except for a few small elements of the ecosystems, the understanding with which the framework is being discussed is that all the ecosystems are important and countries need to play an important role in conservation at the ecosystem level, at the species level, and at the genetic level. The third component that plays an important role is an implementation framework that comes along with this particular framework and the targets. And the implementation framework is very important for countries because, unlike in the past, and based on the experiences of countries, we heard the amount of finances, for example, that are required for countries to achieve the targets. So the financing gap, the implementation capacities, and the ability for countries to deal with knowledge management, to deal with capacity development, to engage with diverse stakeholders is very, very important. And that is why the COP will also have a significant discussion on the implementation plan. The fourth component is related to monitoring and evaluation. There is no point in investing in large amount of resources unless we are also able to monitor and evaluate the impact of both the actions and the investments. So the COP will also come up with a monitoring, reporting, and evaluation plan. And countries actually are working very hard to make it not more difficult or cumbersome for countries to do these processes of monitoring and reporting, but to streamline the reporting and monitoring process. So in that context, a few thematic issues are very, very relevant, which is also important for a country like Thailand. The first one, of course, is related to financing. As you know, there is a huge financing gap, both at the national level and also at the global level. Countries are working very hard on how to fill or how to bridge the financing gap. The second element is related to a discussion on what is called the digital sequence information, or DSI in short, that looks at using genetic resources for technological applications and how countries should be getting the benefits of such use of that information. And lastly and importantly, the third discussion is on how actions at the national level can be more synergistic. As many of you know, countries, including Thailand, are members and parties to a number of multilateral agreements. How countries can actually synergize actions at the national level, at the local level, for impacting biodiversity conservation is also an important consideration and the expectation of the outcomes of the CBD COP as well. So if I can conclude based on some of those elements of what is expected or what is to be discussed at the CBD COP meeting, a few points I'd like to highlight in the context of both the global compact and the discussions on business and biodiversity, but also in the context of Thailand. First, when we are looking at business and biodiversity, to a large extent, our focus has always been on large corporations, multinational companies, and big businesses. But we need to also understand that the medium and small enterprises also play an important and significant role, not only in impacting conservation, but also in scaling up efforts for economic benefit making, especially when it comes to livelihoods and poverty reduction. So one key point for Thailand to consider is that how can you mainstream actions related to biodiversity conservation in the context of the convention that supports small and medium enterprises, that supports development at the local level as well as national level, because collectively it can have an impact at the global level. The second element of it is how to integrate the interests of business in the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan that is to be updated and revised in the context of the new Global Biodiversity Framework, and what will be the role and contribution of the business community and Global Compact in the NBSAP process within Thailand is something very, very important. The third point is to work on skill development. Today, biodiversity-based business is a multi-billion-dollar business. Many of you would have heard of terms like biomimicry, biosimilars, and all that. And these are multi-billion-dollar industries, including focusing on synthetic biology and others. Currently, the focus from business has been rather limited in terms of investment to that. And a country like Thailand could certainly consider skill development and investment development in some of these upcoming technologically important areas. And lastly and importantly, it is important for business to be a part of these actions, but it's also important to formally consider and report on the actions and the impact of these actions through the national reporting process and also through the NBSAP implementation. Thank you very much for your attention.